Quick, name a historically themed 4X game. Chances are the first game that popped into your head was Civilization, and with good reason. It's a juggernaut, bridging the gap between hardcore connoisseurs of 4Xs and more casual strategy game fans, and probably being the most visible face of the genre. However, there have been a number of historically themed 4X games popping out of the woodwork as of late to challenge Civilization's dominance. Humankind is probably the most well known, as having the weight and credibility of the highly successful Endless Space and Endless Legends behind it allows it to become immediately appealing to 4X fans. However, I would argue that Old World, the subject of today's video, deserves to be right up there alongside it. Old World was developed by Mohawk Games, the same studio behind Off-World Trading Company, but what makes Old World especially worth paying attention to is that the lead designer is none other than Soren Johnson, the same lead designer of Civilization 4. You know, the best one out of the entire series. And who better to understand the underpinnings of what works and what doesn't for 4X games than the guy who designed one of the most seminal and popular 4X games out there. In fact, Johnson's goal with Old World was to design a game that was intentionally smaller in scale due to just how long games that cover 6,000 years of human history actually are. What Old World does then is take the 4X formula and set it exclusively in the Age of Antiquity. There are 7 playable civilizations to choose from: Rome, Persia, Babylon, Assyria, Greece, Egypt, and Carthage. Furthermore, it also limits the length of the game by imposing a 200-turn limit on top of the usual slew of victory conditions that one would expect. Assuming that nobody fulfills these conditions, or earns enough victory points to win the game before then, the civilization with the highest number of points wins. So now, by itself, this may have some people twitching, but given the mechanics put in place to regulate the game's flow, I find that this 200-turn limit works really well to maintain the scope and balance of a particular match. And that's because, while the core gameplay loop of Old World is immediately familiar to anybody who's played a 4X game before, Old World employs a number of unique systems that significantly change how it plays compared to some of its contemporaries. First and foremost is just how character-driven Old World can be. Unlike many of the other 4Xs that I've played, Old World puts much more emphasis on individual characters and how they develop over the course of a game. Each one falls into several broad archetypes, such as being a hero, or an orator, or an engineer and the like, and are further augmented by different personality traits. These character classes, such as they are, and traits combine to offer a number of statistical bonuses and penalties. Furthermore, the characters in Old World can interact with one another and be the subject of a multitude of different game events that impact their development, thus giving the game the sort of light trappings that you may expect from something like Crusader Kings, albeit not as deep. But that isn't a detriment to the game. The character development and story threads do so much to enhance the flavor of its setting without creating any overcomplicated systems that would otherwise bog down the strategic elements. There's something like 300 of these story events, some of which follow actual story chains, and all of which affect your character's growth in some manner or another. And these stories are plentiful and varied, with a lot of scenarios popping up that keeps your character story going for as long as they happen to live. As a result, playing through Old World feels less like guiding the early upbringing of a state or a nation, and much more like overseeing the development of an ancient dynasty, a fact that's further emphasized with the fact that if your current ruler dies without an heir, your game's over. In the midst of that, you still need to maintain the balance between yourself, your children, your court, and the opinions of the royal families within your realm, lest you wind up with a rebellion on your hands. Old World even offers an ambition system that serves the dual purpose of being a victory condition and a means of sometimes placating your courtiers. These are dynamically generated goals that represent the personal desires of the leader. Fulfilling 10 of these in a single game lets you win the game outright. And if your character dies before accomplishing them, they become legacy ambitions, which your heir then can fulfill themselves to reap the rewards, but now they have to do so on a time limit before they expire. These characters can also be assigned to different positions, including generals of armies or governors of cities, or they can just fill your council positions, like ambassadors and spy masters, which open up further diplomatic actions against your rivals. However, only certain character classes can fill these roles, and even then you require the proper technological prerequisite before you can even appoint them. Speaking of technology, I love how it's handled in Old World. Rather than following a linear path, technology is randomized via a card drawing mechanic. Any advancements that your civilization has the capacity to research is drawn from a deck of cards. You select one to research, and any that are not chosen are discarded. Once the draw pile is empty, the discarded cards are reshuffled and put back into the draw deck. While the tech tree itself remains static, the individual advancements are thus semi-randomized each time, making each new game feel a bit dynamic as to what options you have immediately available to you. This is further complicated with the inclusion of bonus cards, which are one-time bonuses that are permanently discarded whether or not you decide to grab them. These usually take the form of immediate resources, like a windfall of building resources or a free unit, thus forcing you to decide on whether or not you want to delay any current research for an immediate boon, or if you simply can't afford the distraction right then and there. Another very interesting mechanic that Old World employs is unit movement range and the order system. Each individual movement can move a maximum of 3 times in a given turn, and the maximum range of its movement is outlined in 3 concentric circles. However, you also have a global cap of orders that you can give out, which is seen in the scroll next to your character's portrait. Moving a unit costs an order, but so does attacking, or getting a worker to build something, or anything that furthers the progression and the development of your country. These orders are shared across every single unit in your civilization, meaning that it takes some forethought as to where you want to allocate your orders on a given turn. Otherwise, you might find yourself in a situation where your armies can be cut off, or caught unaware by an enemy, or your development could lag behind. So making sure that you have enough of them to prioritize which is the most pressing thing to do at a given time is absolutely paramount. The number of orders you have does change based on your character stats and their legitimacy, so like everything else in the game, this number is dynamic and it can be increased and decreased as the game goes on. Resource use is pretty straightforward. You gather raw resources like stone and iron to build units and buildings. However, cities also generate more abstract resources that represent your soft power, things like development and culture that your buildings transform your raw resources into. Now these usually come in the form of urban developments. As the name implies, urban developments are built on city tiles, and rural developments on rural ones. And just like in Civ 6, these improvements are built on a per tile basis within your city limits. However, unlike Civ 6, cities in Old World aren't quite as specialized. You can build various military buildings around a city and turn it into a frontier base, but you can also build forts which serve a similar purpose. Economically speaking, Old World tends to be a lot more generalized due to the much more narrow scope of the game. Every city should be building whatever buildings will draw the most resources from whatever tiles surround it, with the game even making it easy by giving you pop-ups with recommended buildings that give you the maximized yield. You can supplement this by building specialists to work on these various tiles that further increase their output. And there are a number of city projects that you can produce in order to develop extra resources and growth, so it does balance out. I find that you also build a lot fewer cities in Old World, as cities can only be built on city tiles that either randomly spawn in the game, or, more likely, that you take by force from your rivals or the barbarians that spawn on the game maps. This does limit overall empire growth, but it makes your empire a lot easier to manage. And when the goal of the game is to make things easier without sacrificing depth, limiting sprawl goes a long way into easing the strains of logistics. Another important mechanic is religion, which is spread through the erection of various shrines throughout the land. It's divided into 2 flavors, the brand of paganism unique to each respective culture that everybody has access to, and the 4 ancient world religions, Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Manichaeism. Religious buildings can be very powerful, and each one provides a relationship bonus with that religion in question. On top of that, they provide science and legitimacy to your empire. Now, legitimacy represents the stability of your realm and your ruler's ability to effectively govern. Each point grants you 0.1 order per turn, and it provides you a higher opinion from your family members. You can also earn cognomina that represent your various achievements, like building wonders or discovering new landmarks. And the fact that you gain legitimacy by discovering new landmarks, that you can then subsequently name whatever the hell you like, is a really nice touch that places just a little bit more importance on exploration, aside from just gathering intel and planning your expansion. I find that it also does a really good job of creating a sense of scale of the ancient world. It's a vast place that's filled with wonders and mystery, despite the game itself being much more focused on a tighter experience that's faster to play. I feel the devs really did capture the best of both worlds when it comes to the scope of the game, and this system is just a way to really emphasize that. On top of all this, Old World has some excellent quality of life features that, after seeing them implemented here, I kinda want to see in every other 4X game going forward. The most prominent of these is the undo button, which is an absolute godsend considering the fact that you only have a limited number of things you can do per turn, and because of that limitation, you can find yourself stymied because of some really bad planning. It's such a small feature, but my goodness does it save you so many headaches. Buying and selling resources is also a breeze. All you need to do is hover over them and select the quantity. You can also control-click on any buildings in the city tab that you don't have the resources to build to automatically deduct gold from your treasury and purchase the necessary materials. You want to hurry the production of a particular unit? The game offers multiple different means of doing so rather than restricting it to a single resource, though each time that you do it, it increases the cost of future hurried units. Road tiles are normally placed down individually, but the Road To function makes it very easy to connect your cities without having to manually order your worker every turn. And what is probably the most convenient feature when learning the game is that you can hold down the Shift key and hover your mouse over any of the linked game terms in the pop-up screens to then open up a Russian nesting doll of tooltips that make navigating the glossary and keeping yourself informed so easy. Need more information? Just hit F1 to instantly open up the in-game encyclopedia. Knowledge is power. It's just a shame then that I find the UI can be a little bit cumbersome at times. The layout itself is fine, and there's nothing too out of the ordinary when compared to other 4Xs, but I find that there was a little bit of an adjustment period when trying to understand what exactly I was looking at. Some resource and trade icons aren't immediately apparent as to what they represent, and many tooltip pop-ups aren't exactly laid out so that they're the easiest things to read at a glance. Maybe it's just how my brain processes information, but hovering over developed tiles and not immediately seeing what improvement the icon represents seems to be a bit counterintuitive to me. And the inherent problem of adding a cast of characters and the ability to interact with them is that there are now more menus that you need to click through in order to get where you need to go. In short, you're going to be spending a lot of time looking at menus and tooltips while playing Old World, which I suppose isn't really out of the ordinary when playing 4X games at any rate. Fortunately, those menus, and Old World's overall look for that matter, are rather good looking. Old World employs a bright color palette that makes every environment and tile stand out vibrantly. Even the tiles with resources on them look well crafted and they're easy to discern from one another. While unit animations are fairly basic, Old World does include a fast movement animation for units that travel great distances, speeding up gameplay without looking awkward or janky. And I especially love the still image artwork used for things like events and character portraits, which look like oil paintings that are really well done and do well to help capture the majesty of these important figures that you're constantly rubbing shoulders with. Old World's upcoming launch on Steam and GOG is also going to coincide with its first expansion pack, the Heroes of the Aegean. As the name implies, this expansion includes a 6-scenario campaign for the Greeks, and acts as a sort of series of bookmarks for some of the major events that occurred during this period of time. The campaign begins with the Battle of Marathon, and ends with the division of Alexander the Great's empire into the successor kingdoms. While all of these scenarios can be played individually, they string together to form an ongoing historical narrative, although campaigns 4 and 5 can be played in any order since those two occur simultaneously. The question then is, how does a 4X game looking to create a smaller scale experience fare at covering 170 years of Greek history? Well, pretty darn well it seems. Generally speaking, the scenarios are a welcome addition because of the gameplay variety they bring to the table, with each one focusing on a different aspect of Old World's core gameplay loop. Some are entirely built with tactical battles in mind, some focus heavily on in-game events that have a significant effect on how the story develops, and some just blend all these elements together to resemble a standard game of Old World, albeit with some specific objectives that come up over the course of play. Scenario 2, on land and sea for instance, is entirely combat focused, covering the battles of Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea. This scenario challenges you with tactical combat that puts you at a disadvantage numerically, but you are given the tools for turning the tide. You're always destined to lose at Thermopylae, and the game even straight up tells you this. However, the better you are at defending against the Persian army, the easier the following battles become through the generation of extra units. On the other hand, Scenario 4, Queen Olympias, features a campaign centered around the political machinations of Alexander the Great's mother, and places a much greater emphasis on character events and storytelling. So much so that it actually replaces the usual family and discontent mechanics with an influence system used to measure your control as opposed to that of the other noble families, and the tech tree with an intrigue tree, which represents all of the political actions that you can take as the story unfolds. Now, I thought that this would be my favorite campaign going into it just based on the premise alone. But I found that the rule changes were rather limiting and the intrigue tree was very underwhelming. The tree itself is relatively small with a limited number of choices, and you're basically going to research all of them on a given playthrough. The only difference is in the order that you research everything. There are no hard choices that lock you down one path or another, and that's a bit disappointing. I suppose I've just been spoiled by the depth that other games with similar mechanics offer, like Hearts of Iron 4, and I know that Old World goes out of its way to narrow its scope, but I found that this scenario just made things a little bit too narrow, and the campaign description didn't really live up to the experience. Now, that being said, I do like the branching storylines and the developments for this campaign, like determining what the true circumstances for the assassination of Philip II of Macedonia were. This campaign can unfold in a number of different ways based on the sequences of events and the order in which they occur, and those themselves are in part based on your own decision making. But still, I find that this gameplay loop isn't all that great, and it's especially marred by the slowdown when you're constantly building new units to support Alexander's campaign in Persia and beyond, with little to do domestically to keep you engaged. It picks up a little bit after Alexander's death, spoilers I guess, but the amount of effort to get to there was way too stretched out. It really shows off why Old World's character interactions and story events are better treated as supplements rather than mainstays, as they're not strong enough to carry the game all by themselves. Out of all the scenarios, the third one, The Rise of Macedon, and the sixth one, Diadochi, resemble the base game the most. The former tells the story of the rise of Macedonia into a dominant Greek power of the era, and the latter covers the disintegration of Alexander's Macedonia into the successor kingdoms. These scenarios play like any other standard game of Old World. However, since they are telling specific stories, these scenarios have a number of events that are unique to them, and since they're presenting real historical events, there are story developments that arise regardless of how your playthrough progresses. Nevertheless, I found that these scenarios offer enough variation to the core gameplay loop that make for plenty of replayability and opportunities to reshape history. It doesn't feel like these scenarios are on rails at all, thereby maintaining the spirit of the base game while providing a story-rich contextualization for your actions. Overall, I quite like this expansion pack. It provides a good amount of content with plenty of gameplay variety, and it takes some risks by trying to explore the different gameplay avenues that Old World has. Some of these experiments work out better than others, but as someone who's always been drawn to narrative contextualization in my strategy games, I find that Heroes of the Aegean is a really good starting point for further fleshing out the game. Not unlike something like the Warlords expansion for Civilization 4, which offered much of the same in terms of specialized content that offers a fresh take on a familiar system. And I kind of feel that that sign-off applies to Old World as a whole. I find the game to overall be genuinely unique and riveting, and the additions that it brings to the table a welcome step forward for the genre. Old World is one of the freshest 4Xs I've played in recent memory, and I feel that a lot of these mechanics and developments could very well be genre mainstays going forward. I love the order systems and the emphasis it puts on tactical planning, and I find that it works surprisingly well. The character interactions are a fantastic touch, as are the events and character growth. While I think that some people may balk at the shortened game length, I found that it actually helped the game pace itself out much better. Don't get me wrong, I love my games of Civ that span entire epochs, but sometimes you just want something that plays a little bit quicker and slicker, and I feel that Old World delivers on that front very well. I quite like this game, and if you can get past a somewhat cumbersome UI and don't have a problem with a compact, smaller 4X game, then Old World is very much worth playing, especially with the Heroes of the Aegean expansion, if for no other reason than the campaign additions are extra content that are a pretty great time to play through. And if nothing else, I think that Old World proves that the adage of not being able to teach an old dog new tricks is unequivocally wrong.